293. That is the number of times since 1946 a single country has walked into the United Nations Security Council and killed a resolution with one vote. Not debated it, not amended it, killed it. No matter how many other countries voted yes, no matter what the resolution was trying to stop. 293 vetoes in 80 years, and in every single one of those cases, without a single exception in the entire recorded history of the institution, the veto was cast to protect a national interest, a geopolitical ally, a financial arrangement, a military position. Not once was a veto cast because the resolution was wrong. It was cast because the resolution was inconvenient. This is not a failure of the United Nations. This is the United Nations working exactly as the 5 permanent members designed it to work. For themselves. Let's go through the numbers. Because the numbers are where the story lives. The Soviet Union, and later Russia, has cast 120 vetoes since 1946. Almost half of all vetoes ever cast. In the early years, from 1946 to 1969, the Soviets cast 93% of all vetoes. The reason is simple. In those years, the United States controlled a majority on the Council. Every resolution favored the West. The Soviets blocked everything they could. Then the world changed. Decolonization happened. Dozens of new nations joined the United Nations through the 1960s. Nations from Africa, from Asia, from the Caribbean. And suddenly the automatic Western majority on the Security Council began to erode. Because these new nations had their own grievances, many of them directed at Western colonial powers. And that is when the United States cast its first veto, March 17, 1970. It had never needed one before. Now it did, and it has used it 82 times since. The United States, 82 vetoes, most frequently, far more than any other purpose, to protect one country, Israel. Since 2020 alone, the United States has cast 14 vetoes. 12 of those 14 were on resolutions about Israel and Palestine. 12. In 4 years. That is not a foreign policy. That is a guarantee. An unconditional shield, written into the architecture of the United Nations itself. And here is the number that reframes everything you think you know about international law. Of the 30 vetoes cast in the Security Council in the last decade, 27 of them were on 3 conflicts: Syria, Ukraine, and the Palestinian territories. 27 out of 30. 3 conflicts, 3 places where the permanent members have direct interests, direct alliances, direct financial stakes, and in each case, the veto protected those interests, not the civilians dying on the ground. Now let's talk about what that actually meant. Not in the abstract. In blood. January 11, 1994. A Canadian general named Romeo Dallaire, commanding the small UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda, sent a fax to UN headquarters in New York. Not a vague concern. A specific warning. He had an informant inside the Interahamwe militia. The informant had been ordered to register every Tutsi in Kigali. He told Dallaire his personnel could kill 1,000 people in 20 minutes. Dallaire's fax asked for permission to raid the weapons caches. To act. To prevent what was coming. Headquarters said no. Do not act. Stay within the mandate. Dallaire sent more warnings. January 22nd, February 3rd, February 15th, February 27th, March 13th. 5 separate warnings, each one more urgent than the last. In February, Belgian authorities were already privately using the word genocide. A CIA analyst calculated that as many as 500,000 people could die if the situation escalated. The Clinton administration had been told. Senior officials had been briefed. Government documents declassified in 2004 confirmed this. April 6, 1994. The Rwandan president's plane was shot down. Within hours, the killing began. The Security Council convened. And then, the United States, still traumatized by what had happened in Somalia the previous year, where 18 American soldiers had been killed, pushed not to reinforce the mission, but to reduce it. American delegates argued for shutting the mission down. The Council agreed to cut the peacekeeping force from 2,500 troops to 270. General Dallaire begged them not to. He later wrote that if he had been given 5,000 well-equipped soldiers, he could have stopped the genocide. He did not get 5,000 soldiers. He got 270, and a mandate that prevented them from protecting civilians. In 100 days, approximately 800,000 people were killed. Not in a war. In a massacre. With machetes. In churches where they had gathered for protection. On roads where they tried to flee. The peacekeepers watched. Because the Security Council had told them not to intervene. There was no veto cast in Rwanda. There did not need to be. The threat of American opposition was enough. The major powers simply refused to act, and the institution designed to enforce collective security had no mechanism to compel them. No geopolitical interest, no oil, no strategic value. Rwanda was, in the words of one American official at the time, small, poor, remote, and African. Irrelevant to the national interest. 800,000 people paid for that calculation with their lives. Now move forward 17 years. 2011, Syria. Protests begin in the city of Daraa in March. Syrian security forces open fire on demonstrators. The Arab Spring is spreading. Within months, a civil war has begun. By October 2011, approximately 2,700 Syrians have been killed. The Security Council drafts a resolution. It would condemn the Syrian government's human rights violations. It would demand an end to violence. It would call for a political process. Russia and China veto it. Their stated reason: it would destabilize the region. The real reason: Russia has a naval base at Tartus on the Syrian coast, its only Mediterranean military facility. Losing Assad means losing that base, and China has its own interests. The precedent of the Security Council authorizing intervention in a government's internal affairs is one China wants no part of. Not with Tibet. Not with Xinjiang. Not with Taiwan. Russia vetoes Syria again, and again, and again. 14 times over 13 years. China joins on 8 of those vetoes. In 2023, Russia vetoes a 9-month extension of cross-border humanitarian assistance into northern Syria. The result? 4.1 million people lose reliable access to food, water, and medicine. Not soldiers. Civilians. 4 million people. Because a single country cast a single vote. By the time the Assad government finally fell in December 2024, more than 500,000 Syrians had been killed. Russia had vetoed every meaningful resolution for 13 years, and sat on the Security Council throughout, as a permanent member with the legal authority and moral responsibility to maintain international peace and security. This is the institution. This is how it works. But here is where it becomes even more complex, because the story is not simply Russia bad, West good. The picture is more symmetrical than that. And your channel exists to show you the symmetry. The United States went to war in Vietnam without a Security Council mandate. 58,000 Americans died. Millions of Vietnamese. Not one resolution was passed against it, because the U.S. would have vetoed it. Kosovo, 1999. NATO bombed Yugoslavia for 78 days. No Security Council authorization. 3 of the 5 permanent members, Russia, China, and the United States, had fundamentally incompatible views on the legality. So NATO simply bypassed the Council entirely. The bombing happened anyway, and the U.S. justified it by saying the Council's paralysis made unilateral action necessary. Think about that logic for a moment. The system is paralyzed because we designed it to be paralyzable. And now that it is paralyzed, we will act outside it. And we will call that justice. Iraq, 2003. Weapons inspectors inside the country. Hans Blix, the chief UN inspector, telling the Security Council publicly, in the chamber on the record, that he had found no weapons of mass destruction and needed more time. France, Germany, Russia all opposed. The Security Council said no. The United States invaded anyway. 46 days after the invasion began, President Bush declared major combat operations over. The weapons were never found. 200,000 Iraqi civilians would die in the years that followed. The country that led that invasion, the same country that had built the United Nations, that had written the principles of sovereignty into the Charter, publicly demonstrated that those principles did not apply when American interests were at stake. And here is what Russia's foreign minister said when justifying the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. He held up a photograph. Colin Powell, United Nations Security Council Chamber, February 5, 2003. Holding up a vial of white powder and claiming it was evidence of Iraqi chemical weapons. It was not. His point was not subtle. You set this precedent. You invaded a sovereign country without authorization. You ignored the Security Council when it inconvenienced you. We are doing the same thing. The architecture you built, we are using it the same way you did. Was he right? That is not a comfortable question, but it is an unavoidable one. The veto was supposed to be a last resort, a safeguard against the Security Council being used as a weapon against the great powers, a guarantee that the system would not collapse if one of the major nations disagreed with a resolution. What it became was something different. It became an automatic shield for allies, a paralysis mechanism for any conflict where the great powers had opposing interests, and, perhaps most importantly, an invisible censorship tool. Because for every veto that was actually cast, there were dozens of resolutions that were never even written, never even tabled, because diplomats and international lawyers already knew they would die before they were born. Why spend 6 months negotiating the language of a resolution when Russia or the United States will kill it in 10 seconds? The Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, never formally addressed by the Security Council, not because members were unaware, because China's anticipated veto made any meaningful resolution pointless before it started. So the Council watched and said nothing. The veto does not just block resolutions. It shapes what is even attempted. It reaches backwards in time, preventing action before action is even proposed. 293 vetoes over 80 years. But the full damage cannot be counted in that number, because that number only captures the ones that were tried. It cannot count the ones that were never attempted. Here is the financial architecture underneath all of this, because this channel always follows the money, and the money is always there. Every veto the United States casts protecting Israel is also protecting $3.8 billion a year in military assistance that flows from the U.S. government to Israel, and almost immediately flows back to American defense manufacturers. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon. The aid goes to Israel. The contracts come home. The congressional districts where those factories sit vote to maintain the aid. The cycle is self-reinforcing. The veto is not just a diplomatic tool. It is a subsidy program for American industry, sustained by a permanent seat at the Security Council. Every veto Russia cast on Syria was protecting the Tartus naval base, access to the Mediterranean, the ability to project military power beyond Russia's borders. Without Assad, that base was in question. Without that base, Russia's naval reach contracts dramatically. The vetoes were not about Syrian sovereignty. They were about Russian geopolitical positioning and the military budget that depends on it. Every veto China has cast, on Syria, on Myanmar, on Taiwan-adjacent issues, is protecting the principle that no external body can use the Security Council to interfere in a government's internal affairs. Because China has internal affairs that it cannot afford to have internationalized. Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong. The veto on Syria is simultaneously a guarantee about China, insurance, cast in the form of a vote. 293 times, one country stood up in the most powerful international institution ever created and said, "Not this, not today." And behind every single one of those moments was a calculation, geopolitical or financial, sometimes both, that had nothing to do with the resolution on the table. The United Nations was built on a promise. The preamble to the Charter begins with 3 words. We the peoples, not we the governments, not we the powerful. We the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. General Dallaire sat in Kigali, watching 800,000 people die with 270 soldiers and an inadequate mandate, and later wrote, If Rwanda's 350 mountain guerrillas had been at risk, he would have received more support from the international community than he did with 1,000,000 human lives on the line. He said that, publicly, and nothing changed. 4 million Syrians lost access to food and medicine because of one vote. 500,000 Syrians died while the council met and debated and vetoed for 13 years. The Rohingya were expelled from Myanmar in one of the most documented ethnic cleansing operations of the 21st century, while the council watched in silence, pre-paralyzed by an anticipated veto that was never even cast. And the institution responsible for all of this, the institution that watched all of this happen and had no mechanism to stop it, still meets every week in New York, still issues press releases, still holds open debates, still calls itself the primary organ responsible for international peace and security. So here is the question this episode will not answer for you, because it is a question that does not have a clean answer. Is a paralyzed institution better than no institution at all? Does the United Nations serve a purpose, even a diminished one, that would be lost if it collapsed? Does the presence of a forum, even a broken one, reduce the risk of direct great power confrontation in a way that makes the failures worth bearing? Or, and this is the harder question, does the existence of the Security Council, with its permanent vetoes and its structural inability to act against the powerful, provide a false legitimacy to a world order that actually runs on raw power? Does it give the appearance of rules where there are no rules? And does that appearance make things worse, by giving cover to violations that would otherwise be more nakedly visible? Rwanda, Syria, Kosovo, Iraq, Ukraine, Gaza. The Council met for all of them. The Council debated all of them. The Council passed some resolutions on all of them. And in every case where the interests of a permanent member were at stake, the system produced either paralysis, or a veto, or silence, or action by a single powerful nation that bypassed the system entirely. 293 times, one country said no, and the world had no answer. In the next episode, we turn to the treaty that was supposed to stop nuclear weapons from spreading. A treaty signed by 189 countries. A treaty with a provision, written into its text in plain language, that the 5 nuclear powers would pursue disarmament. A provision that has never been honored, not once, in 57 years. And we will ask why the countries that followed the rules were punished, and the countries that broke them, or never signed them at all, were rewarded.